I'm Larry Weeks, and this is Bounce.
You know, when I was in graduate school, I was studying these problems about how do you learn under conditions of uncertainty. And then I sat down at a poker table, and boy, was that a really interesting natural experiment. All these things are happening, right? There's all these outcomes, and you're trying to figure out, well, why did that thing happen? Was it because of a good decision? Was it because of luck? And that's all opaque. So what we do is we use this shortcut, which is, well, the outcome was bad, so the decision must have been bad. I think that the outcome anchors us so heavily that we can't see that there's lots of other stuff by which we can determine whether a decision was good. We've all had that experience of we express something with certainty, which is how we tend to express things, and someone says, want to bet. And immediately what that does is it brings to the fore the fact that whenever you make a decision, whenever you declare something, a belief to be true or a prediction, that there's risk in that. The decisions that we make determine in a probabilistic fashion which future ends up unfolding. So when we make a decision, we're betting on that version of ourselves over all other versions of ourselves. So that's a bet against ourselves. It's just different future versions of us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Bounce Podcast. Today on the podcast, my guest is Annie Duke. For 2 decades, Annie was one of the top poker players in the world. In 2004, she bested a field of 234 players to win her first World Series of Poker bracelet. And that same year, she won the $2 million winner-take-all invitation-only Tournament of Champions. In 2010, she won the NBC National Heads-Up Poker Championship. And there is a ton more about Annie. Just Google or wiki her name. But suffice to say, she's very well known for her poker skills and prowess. And some of you, especially those of you who play poker, have probably followed her career because a lot of these, if not all of them, were televised. Prior to becoming a professional poker player, Annie was awarded a National Science Foundation fellowship to study cognitive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. So she now spends her time writing, consulting, and speaking on topics such as decision fitness, decision groups, embracing uncertainty. And Annie's first book for general audiences, Thinking in Bets, Making Smarter Decisions When You Don't Have All the Facts, has just been released as of February 6th. And in it, she reveals lessons cultivated by combining her academic studies in cognitive psychology with real-life decision-making experience at the poker table, which is the topic of this podcast. The book is really good. It's game theory explained in a very unique way, in my opinion. And game theory material can be thick and boring, to say the least. We're talking discrete probabilities, expected value. But Annie makes it way more interesting, fun, and accessible, in my opinion. So this is a podcast about better decision-making, but that encompasses a great deal. It's about equanimity, how to be objective in the face of bad outcomes. And this is resilience, how to unhook your happiness from results. And there's been a lot written about being process-oriented versus results-oriented, but Annie tells you how to actually do that. This is a podcast about what being wrong or right really is, and you'll likely come away, like I did, redefining wrong. I really enjoyed talking to Annie and found out she's a big tennis fan and player, so huge bonus points. We talk about a lot of things on the show, like how she went from academia to poker and was introduced to decision strategy. She tells some great betting stories, so stay tuned for Ira the Whale. We talk about Super Bowl 49 and what was called the worst call in history. We discuss cognitive bias, why we make bad decisions, what being wrong or right really is, probabilities and predictions, and how to use betting to make better decisions in life, whether it's your career, business, where to live, and so on. Our lives are the sum total of our decisions to this point. So I would listen to this podcast and reflect on whether you've made good decisions or whether you've just been lucky so far, and then learn how to make better ones. So without further ado, here's Annie. Annie, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
So first off, if you could just do me a little favor. My dad's 87. He just came through chemo. He's doing good.
Oh.
But he's a big-time poker guy. He plays all the time poker. So if you could,
That's so great.
His name is Grafton. Could you just say hi, Grafton?
high grafted.
He's a
make
big,
great decisions at the table, and also be really lucky.
he is just a big fan. He's not into podcasts, but he's like, "You're talking to Annie? What is that? When is it going to go live?" So he was all excited. So anyway,
Well, I think that we have some stuff in common. So my dad, who's 80, who did not play poker much. I mean, he played a tiny bit when we were growing up, but not really. He now plays in a regular poker game. So when I call him up, he just wants to talk poker with me all the time now.
So my dad, that's his community now. Like when my mom was alive, he gave his word, he's not going to gamble, not going to do any of that. And then she passed away. And if it wasn't for the poker table and the camaraderie he has, I just thank God that he's got this fellowship group where he goes and he has fun and he's challenged.
It's a wonderfully social game. And also I think I think similar to tennis, really good to keep you cognitively sharp. It's because there's a lot of thinking that goes on in both things. And I think that they've shown that people who are playing card games, actually, they stay cognitively sharper. Same thing with tennis.
But I didn't know that you had a fellowship to study cognitive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. That's very interesting. And then I think correct me if I'm wrong, you were either in the middle of your dissertation or you were working on it. And then you went to play poker, visit your brother or something, and then you just left, and then you had a poker career. Tell us the story. How did that happen?
Okay, well, it's close. So I went to the University of Pennsylvania on a National Science Foundation fellowship, and I was there for 5 years. I completed my coursework and my master's, and I was literally I'd done the research. I'd done my qualifying exams. I'd done the research. And I was actually, I had played a tiny bit of poker. My brother was already a poker player, and he had brought me out for a few vacations. Watching poker was fun. But when somebody's sitting in a tournament, you can't sit right behind them. So you're just kind of standing on the rail watching people play, and you can't see the cards, which, gets boring pretty quickly. So he would give me money and send me off to play a little bit just for my own entertainment. So that was while I was in graduate school. And that was really the extent of my poker experience at that point, was watching my brother play and having, this tiny bit of experience myself. So I was on my way actually to my first job talk, and I had been struggling with some stomach issues during the last semester that I was in graduate school. And they really sort of came to a head as I was heading off for my first job talk on my way to NYU. And I actually ended up in the hospital for 2 weeks with some pretty severe stomach issues. So between that and then the recuperation afterwards, I really just couldn't go out on the job market that season. And in academics, the job market is seasonal. So if you miss it, you have to really wait till the next spring. So now I'm recuperating. I had actually was in Montana. My ex-husband, who I was married to at the time, had a house there. And so we went there so that I could get better. And honestly, I just needed money. And I said to my brother, I'm not exactly sure what to do while I'm waiting to kind of finish up at graduate school and go back out onto the job market. And he knew that there were poker games in Montana and suggested that I go start playing to make some extra money. And so I was planning to do that in the meantime before I went out on the job market.
That seems cavalier to me. That I always thought, again, I'm not coming from the poker world, but that there was so much luck involved. That's funny that your brother's like, hell, you need money, go gamble.
My brother had already been doing it for 10 years.
Okay, so it had a proven model or whatever, and he knew.
Yeah, because it was really unusual then. I mean, poker was not on television. It was not celebrated in any way.
So those with some skill cleaned up, I guess, right?
Well, it's still that case. I mean, those with some skills still clean up in poker because it's really, it's like investment. I guess the thing that I would say it's similar to would be like options trading.
That's, by the way, I thought about that. That's your next book. You need to have like investment money management.
Well, I'm thinking about next book. So I may call you up and be like, help me. So basically, it was a time when it would have been extremely unusual for me to have found my way to poker as a living on my own without my brother having forged the way in front of me. So he had moved to New York when he was 18 actually to study chess. And then he through the chess world, had sort of gotten into a little bit of backgammon, but then quite a bit of poker. And he had already been playing for 10 years and was really connected into that world. So that's the only reason why I even know that you knew you could make your living playing poker. It wasn't, my knowledge of poker came through maybe like the Cincinnati Kid or something. You didn't see it on ESPN. So it was actually kind of an interesting thing because I entered that world thinking, well, here I'm doing this thing, and now I really enjoy it. And, I like to joke the meantime, which was supposed to be, a few months turned into 20 years. But at the time, I was actually choosing to do something in which I assumed that I would be incredibly anonymous. So, this shift that happened right around 2002, 2003 was unexpected and quite an interesting little twist in terms of what it was that I ended up choosing to do in the meantime.
Did you like the game before you did it for money in that sense? I'm assuming you played with your brothers and your father or something when you were younger. When I picked up tennis racket and started, all of a sudden, I was hooked. Was there something about poker that worked for you and you just enjoyed the process over time?
Well, so first, I played a lot of cards when I was growing up, but not really any of it was poker. It was, hearts and gin, eventually bridge. But a lot of the same concepts apply in the sense of, you have to deal with a random deal of the cards and, there's hidden information, the cards are face down. And so you have this luck and you have this hidden information element and all of those things. But I think what it was that, when I was in graduate school, I was studying these problems about how do you learn under conditions of uncertainty. And then I sat down at a poker table, and boy, was that a really interesting natural experiment for how do you learn under conditions of uncertainty. And while I don't know that I explicitly recognized the relationship between the two things right away, I think that definitely I was responding to that as this is a really, really interesting problem, and it's combining a lot of stuff that I like. So I think that I just... when I sat down at that poker table, it was this problem that's so incredibly complex where, as you dig deeper into the problem that poker is presenting you, it's this really fascinating thing where what gets revealed is how much more you don't know. I think when you first start the game, I think you have an idea that it's pretty knowable and it's kind of solvable. And you start to learn a few things and you're sort of feeling pretty good about yourself and you're feeling kind of like, oh, you're an expert. And once you get past that first initial sort of feeling like, oh, I'm having things revealed to me, what you discover very, very quickly is what is revealed to you is how unsolvable the game is and how unknowable the game is. And that it's really a matter of how are you making decisions under those conditions in comparison to the other people, not how, I've solved the game. And I think that I loved the challenge of that problem. And I loved trying to figure out how do you learn under those circumstances. It was really fascinating for me. And I think it was just a good fit for the way that my mind works.
And everything you just said is kind of the basis for, I guess, the book. I mean, you kind of take that, what you just said about poker and what you love about it, and it's extrapolated into this book about decision making. I really like the book a lot.
Oh, thank you.
I've got highlights everywhere. I got a bunch of questions for you. My friends, and I've read a lot of books, as you can imagine, for preparing for the show like this. But here's what I really liked. It seems to take game theory and explain it in such a unique and very practical, take it and use it way that everybody can benefit from it. Not every paper or book on game theory is, in my mind, is easily digestible. You know what I mean? It's like, oh yeah, that's interesting, and there's the math. But I want to go into the book. I have some questions here. But before I leave the poker, the betting world, there's this great story in the book about Ira the whale. So, by the way, is that true? Is it a true story?
Well, I want to say that it happened to a friend of mine, not to me. It happened to my friend David Gray. But as far as I know, it has been confirmed. It is not under dispute.
So tell a story real quick, if you don't mind.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a bunch of people. They're actually horse bettors. And one of them is a friend of mine, David Gray, which is how I end up knowing the story. And there was a guy in the group named Ira the whale. And, Ira the whale came to the name honestly. Let's just say that. So a discussion just broke out where there was a dispute about how many White Castle hamburgers Ira the whale could eat. Now, for those people who don't know what a White Castle hamburger is, it's a tiny little slider. It's a little square slider, so small. At any rate, the number that was settled on was 100. And most of the people were betting against, as you can imagine. I mean, most people would bet against any human being being able to eat, even, as small as those were, it was 100. But David Gray, who this was very much at the beginning of his career, David Gray, had a very successful career, still does, playing poker, but this was at the beginning of his career. And he bet $200, which was really a lot of money for him, on Ira the whale being able to eat these 100 White Castles. So they head off to White Castle, and David Gray tells it. He says, I knew I was a lock to win the bet when Ira ordered the burgers 20 at a time, but with the first 20, he ordered a shake and fries.
Shake and fries, I remember. Yeah, and he won the bet. The guy, and then he ordered. He eats 100, then he orders another 20, right, to go or
for
something.
For his wife, for Mrs. Whale.
Okay, so
yeah, for Mrs. Whale.
So what I was going to ask you before we left the kind of the pure poker discussion was, what's the weirdest thing you've seen people bet on of some significance?
So this actually got cut from the book just because I felt like I was, sort of wandering off into the world of, and there's a few bets in there already. And I don't know, I just felt like this was kind of wandering off, but I'm going to give you something from the cutting room floor. How about that? So the weirdest bet that I could tell you, well, they're actually similar to each other, but there's this guy, Brian the Wiz, and Brian the Wiz is otherwise famous for having somebody bet him $100,000 that he wouldn't get breast implants. This is actually a pretty well-known story. So yeah, you probably have heard about this guy, but he got the breast implants. And he got paid the $100,000. And to this day, I think he still has the breast implants in. But weirdly enough, that's not the bet I'm going to tell you about, he bet somebody about living in their bathroom for a month. And so he did. He lived in somebody's bathroom.
That he couldn't, does that mean he couldn't leave
he could not leave the bathroom. And the person kept sending people into the bathroom to use it, and Brian had to stay in the bathroom.
Okay, so it wasn't just him at night going home and sleeping in the bathroom.
No, he had to live in a bathroom for a month.
Wow.
And he did it. I mean, it was so clear.
What was the bet? What was the bet? How much?
I wish I could remember. I want to say it was like $15,000, but I'm not sure. That one I'm really not sure about, but I do know that I think it was after 2 weeks that they settled and paid him because it was so annoying to have him live in their bathroom. So I think they ended up like, all right, you're obviously going to stay for the whole month. And they ended up paying him and he was allowed to leave the bathroom. I know there was a bet being negotiated also for someone named Huxley to live in someone named Ted Forrest's closet. I'm not sure if that one ever came to fruition or not. But there's definitely some strange bets. I know there was another bathroom bet where somebody set up a webcam to make sure that the person wasn't actually exiting the bathroom. And like they made it public and put up a reward so that people would sort of monitor the webcam so that if anybody saw the guy leave the bathroom, that there would be a reward involved. So that,
So let's talk about decision making. So your point in this book, Thinking of Bets, great title, by the way, is poker's a great lab for decision making because of the level of uncertainty. There's not a straight mathematical solution. You don't see the cards, and you have got to place bets or not, right? You're making decisions all the time. And one of the things that I really I thought was great was you write about resulting, and you use Super Bowl 49, I believe. It's the Seattle Seahawks, right? There's 20 seconds or something along those lines remaining. They're behind by 4 points. Second down at the Patriots 1 yard line. Everybody's expecting Seahawks to hand off to Marshawn Lynch. Short yardage. He doesn't. It's a pass. It's intercepted. And so the headlines the next day are worst play in history. And you in the book are saying not necessarily. In fact, maybe I think you actually outline all the possible decisions he could have made, and that it was actually a good call? Or do I have that wrong?
Well, so I think that I'm probably not enough of an expert to say definitively that it was a good call. Let's put it this way. There are some very good mathematical arguments for why that was a completely reasonable and I think importantly creative call to make. I think there are also some arguments that have to do with, which I've since learned actually since publishing the book, with the formation that the Patriots had lined up. So Belichick himself, I've learned since the book was published, actually has defended that play. And a guy named Mike Lombardi, who's with The Ringer, who's a pretty famous analyst of and actually has done coaching, like worked under Belichick and Bill Walsh. Actually, he has a book coming out in September where he opens with the exact same play, and he defends it also from the standpoint of the formation. So this is I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of consilience, where from separate paths, you get to the same answer. So these are kind of football guys saying, if you look at the formation that the Patriots had, it was something where it looked like they were going to defend the pass, but they were actually lined up to defend the run. Okay, so that's from their side. That's not in my book. I didn't even know about that until after I published the book. The defense that I give actually is derived mainly from Benjamin Morris on 538, also from a writer on Slate, talking about the mathematics of the situation. And it's relatively simple to run through. It's 26 seconds left. They have one timeout on second down. So if they run the ball, if Marshawn Lynch doesn't get in, then they can only stop the clock by calling the one timeout they have, which then, of course, runs the clock down so much that they only get one more chance at the end zone. So once you choose that run play, you're really saying, I'm going to take two shots at the end zone on down 2 and 3. And if I don't get in on the first try, I'm going to burn my timeout in the process. If you run a pass play, there's 3 outcomes that can occur. One is obviously the ball gets caught. And then assuming that the Patriots don't come back and score, which would be very unlikely, you've just won the game. The other would be the ball gets dropped. And what's important about the ball getting dropped, which happens a lot of the time, is that the clock stops naturally, and it actually stops in time for those exact same 2 running plays to get run. So what that means is that the pass doesn't actually cause you to give up the run plays unless it gets caught, which is good for you, or it gets intercepted, which is obviously bad for you. But so then what you want to ask yourself is, okay, the cost of the pass play is really just the interception rate. That's all that it costs you, is how often does the ball get intercepted? Because the other 2 things are fine. The other 2 outcomes are fine. The touchdown is obviously really fine. And the ball getting dropped is also fine because it stops the clock and you run those 2 pass plays anyway. So you're not giving anything up by doing it. So how much does that cost? And the interception rate is around 1 or 2%. So it's a very small price to pay to get 3 shots at the end zone instead of 2. Now, when you combine that with, what Mike Lombardi and actually Bill Belichick himself have said, that they were actually lined up to defend the run, then I think it probably sounds even better. The interesting thing is that Pete Carroll really understood that, because he was asked about it on the Today Show. And they were trying to get him to say, yeah, that was a really big mistake. I ran such a terrible play. And what he said was that it was the worst result of a call ever, which is a big distinction.
And that's the point, a big point, I think, in your book is that we're all guilty, and in that case, people are guilty of resulting, which is you're assuming the quality of the decision is based upon the result of that decision versus all the possible decisions that could have been made, right? So in the example of poker, you may have a hand that's mathematically 80% chance of winning the pot, right? Mm-hmm. 20% chance of losing, somebody else getting lucky. That happens. Doesn't mean that you played the wrong hand. So you made the best decision based on what you knew at the time. And you wouldn't say that you played the wrong hand just because you lost that pot, somebody else got lucky. And let me know if I'm getting this right. I'm probably not summing it up right.
No, you're summing it up actually exactly right. I mean, I think here's the problem is that, you're all these things are happening, right? There's all these outcomes, and you're trying to figure out, well, why did that thing happen? Was it because of a good decision? Was it because of luck? And that's all opaque, right? Nobody's exposing that to you. You don't know I can't just watch that play and know the mathematics or know what that formation meant or know what the percentage of X, Y, or Z to happen was. So it's all very opaque, so it's hard. So what we do is we use this shortcut, which is, well, the outcome was bad, so the decision must have been bad. It's a shortcut to try to get us to an answer for something that is on one trial somewhat unknowable just based on the outcome of one time. So, a very simple example would be if I flip a coin and you call it heads and it lands heads, that doesn't mean that your decision to call heads was necessarily good. It doesn't mean that I should use that to say you're a good coin caller, right? It's just one time. We don't really know. Another really simple example would be, and I think people get this when you make it something that's much more obvious, where sort of the idea of what a good decision in this situation would be more settled. So if you're, going through an intersection and you purposely run a red light, I don't think people think that's a good decision, even if you happen to get through it safely. But that's sort of how we're behaving. Yeah. So the reason why people say, oh, that's silly, of course it's not, is because whether that's a good decision is a matter of, it's settled pretty much, right? We've sort of settled on that because it's a decision that happens all the time and we kind of know if that's a good, or we have agreement about it. But when you're looking at, was the pass play good? Or how was my sales strategy? Or should I have made this investment? Or, should I have married this person? Or am I choosing the right way to raise my children? Or this trial strategy, is it a good one? Or any of those things. The answer is to whether it's good decision. Why did something turn out the way it did? Is it because it was a good decision? Is it because of luck? It's probably a combination of the two. What's contributing to what? It's very opaque. And you can't just sort of pull back some curtain and have somebody tell you the answer. So how do you get there? And what happens is that we make this very consistent error, which is resulting.
It's great. I think you use the phrase that I'm going to use it. We're outcome junkies.
Yes, we are.
And you say the more we wean ourselves from that addiction, the happier we'll be. And I get it. I just, as I was reading the book, I was trying to figure out, outcomes, in most cases, it seems, are the only thing that is visible, right?
That's right.
So, there's no TV show showing everybody's cards or all the factors in the decision and the percentages or the decision tree. So the only thing you have to measure, it seems, is the outcome. And I think it's your contention in the book that that's not how you want to, you really want to kind of separate from the outcome because of luck and other things. But go ahead.
Right. So here's the thing. I think that the outcomes anchors us so heavily that we can't see that there's lots of other stuff by which we can determine whether a decision was good. Now, let me make something really clear. If you have enough outcomes, you can tell something from them, right? That's the basis of science. So in science, they talk about a sample size that's too small, right? And a sample size that's just right or, large enough. And obviously, if you have a large enough sample size for the amount of variance in whatever it is that you're measuring, because obviously the less variance there is, the smaller the sample size has to be in order to be able to detect the signal. Right. So if we're playing chess, we need to play way fewer games than if we're playing poker in order to determine who's better, because there's less variance in chess. So scientists are all about figuring out, when do I have enough outcomes given the amount of variance in order to be able to say something significant about this data sample. The problem that we have in life is that usually we don't have enough outcomes to say anything that's of value based on the outcome alone. And that's where we get into trouble, is that once we have the outcome, I think that we do get into this place, which is what you articulated, which is, but isn't that all we have? And I would argue, no, that's really not all we have. It's just that once you know the outcome, it so completely overshadows all the stuff that we do have in order to determine whether a decision was good. So let me give you a couple of examples actually from the conversation we've just been having. If I say to you, well, I was driving along and the light was red, but I really just had this feeling that there weren't any other cars that were going to come through the intersection. So I just, drove on through the red light. Now, I haven't told you how it turned out. can you still determine whether that was a good decision for me? Right. And I haven't told you the outcome. Now, imagine if I described to a bunch of football analysts this Pete Carroll decision. I didn't tell them it was Pete Carroll. I didn't tell them it was the Seahawks against the New England Patriots. In other words, I just got rid of the details that might let them know exactly how that turned out so that I can create a situation where they really don't know how it turned out. Don't you think that their analysis of that would actually have been much more rational? I mean, certainly, I don't think that they would have said that was the worst play call in Super Bowl history. And I think we know that because we can do a really simple thought experiment and we can see how much gravitational pull on our analysis the outcome has. And it's a simple thought experiment. What do you think that the headlines would have looked like the next day if that ball had been caught for the game-winning touchdown? We kind of know that because the Patriots, against the Patriots, the Eagles did something that was similarly creative, right? They ran the Philly special and it worked out. And they did something that was unexpected because people expected that they were going to, just go for the extra 3 points. It was on 4th down. So they thought they were just going to hit the field goal there. And they went for this play and it worked out. Now, you can imagine that if the Eagles had gone on to lose that game by some margin that was close to that Philly special situation, if it had been intercepted in the end zone or Foles had just dropped the ball, that people would have been going back and saying horrible things about that play as well. But it worked out fine. And so people talked about how great it is. That's how much gravitational pull the outcomes have on you, such that when you know the outcome, I think that what happens is that you get into that place that you just talked about where you can't imagine how you could possibly evaluate the decision in absence of the outcome. And the opposite is true. It's almost as if, how can I possibly evaluate the decision in the presence of the outcome? At least when you're talking about a small sample size.
You're right. People tend to, and I still do it. You result immediately. It's emotional. It's visceral. Where I should have made the decision the other way. But what we don't do is a postmortem. We don't personally. For decisions, we do it in business, or some businesses do it. Right? They'll reflect on what went wrong, why did it went wrong, and was it a good decision or not? But we don't do that personally, right? We're like, to where we don't reflect to say, did I make the best decision with the given knowledge that I had and all the circumstances, and what percent of this was luck? To your point, we're not good at probabilities either, where we don't think in those terms. Everything's 0 to 100%.
So, I think that we do attempt to do some of the post-mortem work, certainly in businesses, a little bit in our own lives. But like I say, once you know the outcome, I think that it really distorts that process. Because I think that what naturally happens is that when you have a good outcome, you're looking for the good things that you did so that you can repeat them. And do you know what you're not looking for? The bad things you did along the way. Because last time I checked, I can make some pretty poor decisions and have things work out pretty well. Right. So you want to be really looking at both sides. And I think that when you have a good outcome and you're doing a postmortem on that, then, you're deconstructing sort of the process there. You're looking for the good stuff. And when you have a bad outcome, you're specifically looking for the bad stuff.
Yeah. You don't ask where were we lucky?
Or where did I make a decision and get unlucky would be the reverse of that as well. Because you want to ask all of those questions. So what I would argue is that, again, you want to kind of try to figure out a way to do this stuff either before the outcome is known, right? So be doing a lot of analysis of what your strategy looks like before you actually find out how it works out. The example would be if you're a trial lawyer, it would be really good to analyze your trial strategy before you got a verdict, to really spend that time while the jury's, deliberating, to really walk through with experts. In your firm or whatever, here was my trial strategy. Here's what I did. Here's how I executed on it, and start to get, but we don't know the verdict. We don't know how it's going to turn out yet, and have really do some good deconstruction before you get anchored to what that outcome is as much as possible. But if you can't, if for whatever reason, the outcome is already known, it's already happened. This is a problem in poker because outcomes come very quickly, obviously. You can communicate to other people as a communication style in a way that you leave the outcome out of the question. So an example, I know that you play tennis a lot, would be to say, Well, so I was playing against this particular guy, and I was trying to decide whether I should serve in volley or not. And here are the things that went into my decision. First of all, here's what my first serve percentage is. Here's how I am at net. Here's what percentage of the points I win when I go up to net. Here's how much he lobbed. You're a tennis player. You can go through all the things that would determine whether you think that serve and volley is a particularly good strategy there. So walk through all the pros and cons of that, and then say, so what do you think? Do you think that that serve and volley was good? Do you think that how often should I have been trying to come up to net? Should I have been waiting only until I had a really, really good first serve, or should I have been more aggressive about it? And talk through all of that. Never mention whether you won or lost. Just don't say it. And it's very tempting to say it, but don't say it, because once you tell the person that you lost the match, how don't you think their reasoning is going to be such to make it make sense that your chosen strategy was obviously poor?
I actually went through that process. I played a tournament over the weekend, and I was losing in the back of the points at the back of the court. So, I said, the few times I was at the net, I was good. So start coming in, and the percentages went up. But I mean, sometimes a strategy is not working, so you make these other decisions to see if you're going to get a different result. So, yeah, what I love about this whole process is it's comforting in a way when you're wrong or when the decision doesn't turn out, because there are other factors besides things that you could control. And a lot of times we don't think about that there's so many factors, other variables, to your point, other things that are noise that we tend to take the blame totally on ourselves. On the other hand, it's also humbling it can be humbling if your decision turns out right, if you consider how much luck is a factor, right? So there's something grounding in reality. There's something about this process brings to me to the forefront reality. Hey, what really happened, right?
Yeah. So there's a very strong tendency. So when we're evaluating somebody from afar who is not our peer, someone like Pete Carroll, the way that we tend to overly connect outcomes and decisions is really just by saying whatever the quality of the outcome is, that must be the quality of the decision. That's the shortcut that we take. So, we're looking at Pete Carroll. Obviously, I'm not in competition with him. I'm not an NFL coach. And so I just, I'll just say, oh, he had a bad outcome. That must have been a bad play call. Oh, he had a good outcome. I guess that was a good play call. When we're evaluating decisions for ourselves, I think that one of the things that you just brought up and you touched upon was this idea of sort of how painful is the analysis, or how happy does the analysis make us? And that idea of wanting to feel good about ourselves, right? I mean, because I think that that's a lot of the motivation in terms of the way that we evaluate our own decisions, is trying to find a narrative that creates good PR for ourselves. Like we're trying to be good PR agents for ourselves. Is that when we have a good outcome, we're very quick to take credit for it and try to put it over into the skill bucket, right? This is a good decision, good outcome, great decision making on my part. But when you have a bad outcome, who wants to onboard that to your own decision making? So you have a tendency actually just to put it over in the luck bucket. So this is a different way in which we draw an overly tight connection between outcomes and decision quality. In this case, it's in order to forward the positive narrative that we want to have of ourselves. And notice that this causes a really huge problem for learning, because now when we have good outcomes, we say, oh, that's skill. And we're very likely to not take too cold an eye, too unbiased an eye, to say, well, was it really all skill? Where did I get lucky? Maybe I made good decisions, but so yes, that moved me toward this good outcome, but maybe I could have made better decisions, right? That's another question that you could ask yourself. And that doesn't feel good, right? We just want to sort of bask in the glow of the good outcome and our own good decision making.
Well, it could lead to worse decisions. So if something happens and X percent of it is luck and we're not cognizant of that, or we don't think about that, then our hubris or overconfidence could make us have a bad outcome if we didn't learn from that.
Yeah. I mean, I think that, a good example, I can give you a good example from my own life, which is there were quite a few strategies that I employed for many, many years that, I just thought were working out for me because I was kind of, they seemed to be working and I was winning at them. And it wasn't until I started teaching poker and I had to coherently explain the strategy to another human being. It turns out Richard Feynman was right about most things, and that if you can't explain it to an 8-year-old, there's probably a problem. Well, if I can't explain it to a beginner poker player, there's probably a problem as well. Where I actually realized that I wasn't maximizing. It wasn't so much that the decisions were terrible, although sometimes I did discover that as well, that I was actually making decisions that were quite poor. But sometimes it was just that I was making a decision that was sitting somewhere in the middle. And it happened to be working out for me, and I wasn't taking too hard a look and examining it because that wouldn't feel good. Where was the credit in that? And it wasn't until I was trying to actually teach strategy to somebody else that I figured out, I can't really justify this very well. And now I got to really go back and look and think about all these mistakes that I've probably been making over the years, and think about really what the appropriate line of play is in this spot. My game actually changed tremendously at the point that I started teaching poker, mainly because it forced me to look at, I was a winning player. I think I just wasn't looking too hard at some of these things.
So then in this context, how do you look at losing or failure, Annie? Is it just it's feedback?
Yeah. So I think it depends on what you define losing as. So this is something where I think that you want to think about really what's the goal of the game? Like, what's the game that I'm trying to play? So the way that you define winning if you're playing basketball is very different than the way if you're playing chess, which is very different than the way you would define winning at apples to apples, or Monopoly or whatever it is. So the game itself kind of determines what it means to win. So what I really recommend is that you change what that definition of the game is that you're trying to play. So this is the way that I like to think about it, is that there's game, which is the game of being right, and the game of being accurate. So let me explain what the difference between those two things are, because I know that they sound similar. The game of being right is I want to feel like the things that I believe are true, that I'm a smart person, and that the model that I walk around with of the world is generally right. Now, what that really causes is confirmation bias and this larger pattern called motivated reasoning, because if we're reasoning to be right, that's the goal of the game, then what we're trying to do is affirm the things that we already think. We're just trying to affirm our priors, right? So, say I'm just trying to say that I think that free trade is a really great thing for the country. I don't want someone to give me evidence that that's not true. And so I will sort of ignore it, and I'll read all sorts of articles about how great free trade is, just as an example. I mean, this would be like a political party in general, right? If you are a Democrat, you're reading things that are left-leaning. If you're a Republican, you're reading things that are more conservative. And we're tending to read the stuff that's affirming the things that we already believe, because that makes us feel like we're right. So that would be reasoning to be right. Reasoning to be accurate is to say, what I really want to do is construct the most accurate model of the objective truth, right? I want my beliefs to most accurately represent what is objectively true. Now, if you think about the construct of betting, right, the title of Thinking in Bets, if we're betting against each other on any kind of regular basis, who do you think is going to win the bet? The one who's reasoning just to affirm their priors, or the one who's reasoning to try to create the most accurate representation of the objective truth? I mean, it's the second person. So if you understand that every decision that you make is a bet, and that those bets are informed by your beliefs, and those are what create how your future turns out, you've now changed kind of what the goal of the game is. And now what happens is that when you change your mind about something, when somebody tells you a new piece of information that disagrees with you, you don't view it as a threat anymore, because you didn't consider yourself to be right in the first place. You considered everything to be in progress toward, all my beliefs are in progress and under construction toward trying to construct this really good model of the objective truth. And so winning for me is getting to that goal. So changing my mind now feels like winning to me because I feel like I've moved toward the goal, right? So I love when I change my mind. I love when I give credit to somebody.
Because you're more accurate or getting closer to accuracy or becoming more accurate.
You're moving closer to accuracy. Yeah. So it's just, it's
which
like,
is reality. Yeah.
Yeah. It's just changing what the rules are the game of. So let me make clear. I don't live in this dark, dour world where I don't ever get to feel good about myself, right? Where I don't get to be a good PR agent for me, Annie. It's just that I've changed what I feel good about. I feel really, really good when I feel like I've been open-minded. I feel really, really good when I feel like I've changed my mind. I feel really good when I feel like I've given credit to somebody. I particularly feel really good when I feel like I've given credit to somebody that I don't particularly like much, right? When I've heard somebody who in general I disagree with, but boy, this one thing that they said actually made a lot of sense. And I'm now going to incorporate this into my belief. That feels particularly good because I know that that's hard.
I love it. I love it. And a big part of, as simple as it is, people ask me, well, what do you think about this or that? And if I'm unsure, I have said before, yeah, I'm 70% sure or whatever.
Yeah.
But I've never thought through betting on it, which to me, because we have all these cognitive biases, and most of them you kind of outline or lay out in the book. We've got self-serving bias. We have all these biases. It's hard to cut through that. But if you say, if you were to bet on your answer or bet on that decision, what's the probability? How much would you bet, or what's the probability? I think Nassim Taleb said in Anti-Fragile that risk focuses the brain, right? If you were to put money on that, what do you think?
Yes.
Right? It tends to. There's something, something in my survival mechanism that goes, okay, hang on, let me try to be clear. So I love that. So it's, do you want to bet? Would you bet?
Yeah. So I think that we've all had that experience of, we express something with certainty, which is how we tend to express things. And someone says, want to bet. And immediately what that does is it brings to the fore the fact that whenever you make a decision, whenever you declare something, a belief to be true or a prediction, that there's risk in that. It's just that I think that we tend to think about bets as like we're betting money between each other, you win, I lose or something. But what we're investing in terms of moving us toward this set of uncertain futures is not necessarily money. It's our time. We can only invest our time in one thing at a time. We can only live in one place at a time. We are only married, well, most of the time, we're only married to one person at a time. I guess that there are other places where you can be married to.
Accurate. You're not. Yes. You move toward accuracy.
I know. But even so, you can only be. You can't. Let's say a man can't be married to every single woman in the world. You got to.
Damn it!
I know it. It's so
all
horrible.
Right.
But I mean, I give the simple example of this: when you're in a restaurant, you only order the one main dish, and by doing that, you're foregoing all the other dishes that you can choose. And what you're really betting on is that your enjoyment of that meal will be greater. You're investing your enjoyment here. My enjoyment of the meal will be greater if I choose this dish over all others. And of course that's uncertain. It's just you're thinking that the probability is higher because you could order the chicken and think, oh, that looks like the best. And I think that's got the highest probability of making me happy and making me enjoy this meal. And then it turns out to be the driest, most disgusting chicken you ever had. That doesn't mean it was a bad decision, right? It means that was among the set of possible things that you were imagining. So what betting does is it just brings up that idea that whenever we're making a decision, we're hurdling ourselves to some future, foregoing all other choices, and that, of course, there's risk in that.
So you say in the book that we mostly bet against ourselves. Why do you say that?
So I think that one of the reasons why people don't think about decisions as bets is because they think about that as in this particular sort of transactional, we're betting on some sort of thing that we agree is gambling. And it's an exchange of money where it's zero sum. I win, you lose, you win, I lose. And the wins and losses are symmetrical. And it tends to be money. But it's this thing that I just said of when you make a particular decision, you're foregoing all the other decisions. So what I'm saying is that the Annie that results from ordering the chicken in the future will be better off than the Annie that results from ordering the other menu items under consideration. So if I'm trying to decide between the chicken and the fish, what I'm saying is that chicken Annie will be happier than fish Annie. So that's a bet between chicken Annie and fish Annie. I'm betting on chicken Annie. So now I think that we've all had this feeling of you now get the really dry chicken. And that moment where you say, I should have known, is really fish Annie saying, I told you should have picked me. Why didn't you pick the Annie who's eating the fish? In the story that you alluded to where someone moves to Des Moines, Iowa, they're betting that Des Moines, Iowa is going to be better than all the other thems that exist in any other place that they could be, because he can only be in one place at one time. So there's all different ways that our future can turn out. And the decisions that we make determine in a probabilistic fashion which future ends up unfolding. So when we make a decision, we're betting on that version of ourselves over all other versions of ourselves. So that's a bet against ourselves. It's just different future versions of us.
Got it. So just own it. Hey, you're placing bets all the time. Own it.
You're placing bets all the time.
And try to get better at it. Yeah. So which brings me to the point. You use the time travel scenario a lot to the book, which is cool. Do you have a favorite time travel movie, Annie?
Well, it's hard not to love Back to the Future, but I have to say that my favorite time travel movie is actually the original Terminator.
That's a pretty good one.
And the reason why I really love it is because the time travel actually works. In other words, the Terminator had to have gone back in order for that future to have occurred, right? So it's completely circular. So I'm not such a fan of time travel movies where
it's got to make
the
sense to you.
character goes back and actually, it's got to, yeah.
I'm at Google. I'm sitting with a bunch of engineers having lunch, Annie, and there's a conversation among these engineers on time travel movies.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Now I'm just like, I'm just trying to join in the conversation. So they're talking about which movie is the best and all this. And I mentioned, I can't remember what did I mention? I mentioned a time travel movie, Bruce Willis, Looper. I mentioned Looper or something.
Yeah.
And these guys cut my head off and talked to me as if time travel was a reality, but certain movies did not present that reality correctly. I just thought it was, what's the favorite time travel movie? These guys were serious. They're like, there's no way, that's not possible, because I was like, whoa.
Looper doesn't really work, but it does. 12 Monkeys works because Bruce Willis was there.
That's
and
exactly
he has the memory.
That's what they were. But I didn't know it was like, a serious. I was going for the entertainment. So one of the things that I had a question for you that you would be perfect to answer, not only obviously because you wrote the book, but as far as optimistic and pessimistic explanatory style. So I'm going back to Martin Seligman and learned helplessness and all, or I'm sorry, learned optimism, I believe.
But, well, he also did learned helplessness, to be fair. So that wasn't you misspeaking. He was the guy who did that. Yeah.
So, and correct me, but I think, especially for learned optimists, the overall thesis was that optimists tend to do better, whether that be students or money or health or something along those lines. Going back to decision making and probabilities and trying to be objective, how does that fit into this, in the sense that an optimist could make bad decisions? I'm trying to fit in. Is optimism counterproductive to a good decision, right? If they're thinking, it's always going to work out. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I think that it depends on how you define optimism. First of all, I'm going to just go back to that. It's like, what's the game? So first of all, I really recommend people read a book called Rethinking Positive Thinking, which is by Gabrielle Oettingen. And she really talks about the difference between having a positive goal and only having positive fantasies of that goal. So as we're imagining, like, we want to have positive goals. Like, there's no question about that. And the literature says, like, if you're trying to lose weight, you say, by the end of the year, I want to have lost 20 pounds, and you have that positive goal that you're moving toward, you're going to do much better. But the question is, what are you imagining on the way to that goal? Are you just imagining all the great things that are going to happen, and you're going to stick to your diet, and you're going to get to the gym every day, and at the end of it, you're going to meet the love of your life, because you're going to look so great, and you're going to feel great about yourself, and all the stuff in your life is going to be solved. So that would be just really sitting in a positive fantasy about a positive goal. Or do you have a positive goal and you're imagining in a realistic way some of the negative things that might occur? So, for example, some of the obstacles that might occur along the way, like, oh, it's going to be really hard in the break room because, Bob always leaves cookies in the break room. And that's going to be really hard in the middle of the afternoon when I'm hungry. What am I going to do with that? What if I eat those? Or when we're in the conference room and everybody has bagels, or when it's, so-and-so's birthday and I really want the cake. And what if I can't get to the gym? Right. And here's one, like, what if I lose the weight and my life doesn't really change? Like, I think it's going to change in all these really great ways, but maybe it won't. So when you actually do that, that's really what we call a pre-mortem, which is imagining that things don't quite work out the way you want and sort of going back and figuring out, okay, why did that happen? Now, what Gabrielle has found is that people who just sort of do the wholesale positive exercise, right, which is just, I have this positive goal and it's just going to be great all along the way, are actually much less likely to reach the goal than the people who set positive goals, but then imagine the obstacles along the way. And you can think about this just in terms of like military planning, right? Like, we're going to go invade. It's probably good to have some reconnaissance of what the terrain looks like and what the obstacles might be along the way, so that you can, first of all, figure out how to avoid them. And second of all, have contingency plans in place just in case those things go wrong. And that's probably more likely to get you to that positive goal. And that's her point, is that if you imagine a failure point, like the failure point might be the break room and Bob's cookies, then I can think about what can I do in order to really lower the probability that I'm going to eat those cookies. How am I going to feel? Well, let me think in advance. Like, if I actually do slip up and eat the cookies, like, what is my plan going to be? And you can think in advance about, you know what, it's okay, because sometimes people slip up and I kind of know that will happen sometimes. And then maybe you don't blow your diet up because you get really emotional about it because you've thought about it in advance. So I think that we don't want to confuse those two things. If you'll let me, like, I want to relate this to poker a little bit. People used to say to me, like, well, don't you need to be like the most confident, person, have the biggest ego ever to be a great poker player? And I said, well, actually, that can hurt you, because you need to have humility in the face of the game. You need to understand that the game is hard. That yes, you have this positive goal of winning for sure. And we all think about ourselves being winners, but the game itself is really, really hard. And you need to think about the obstacles that the game itself presents you in order to actually get to that positive goal. Now, I can think that I can do a better job of that than my opponents, right? That's a form of confidence, but I'm never going to be confident. I'm never going to be confident in that sense in the face of the game. I have to actually be quite humble in the face of the game.
So that's very interesting. Do you go into, especially in your professional career, but when you play poker and we got a lot on the line, did you go in with a fair amount of equanimity? I mean, did you go in with no expectations?
No, not initially. Initially, I thought, my brother's a professional poker player. He's taught me everything I know. I'm obviously going to be awesome, and everybody I'm going to play against is going to be bad and an idiot, and I'm obviously just going to win. And, that definitely hurt me. And I think that I was super, super lucky because I was in with a crowd that was incredibly intolerant of that thinking. I'm sure in no small part because they had been playing for 10 years and had and really kind of created a study group of their own. And I think they understood that kind of thinking was really unproductive. And what goes along with that kind of thinking is when you win, you're just talking about how great you played. And when you lose, you're just talking about how unlucky you got. And that's really not very productive for becoming better, because what you actually want to do is say, where do I have questions? Where do I think I went wrong? Where did I see a strategy from somebody else that I think was kind of interesting and I don't understand it? And I'm trying to figure out whether it was just a losing strategy or maybe it was a really brilliant strategy and I'm just not good enough yet to understand it and I should really be thinking about it. There's all these questions you want to be asking. So I tell the story in the book about, going up to Eric Seidel, who's, absolutely one of the greatest players to have ever played the game. And initially when I started playing, going up and, complaining to him and just talking about these bad things that had happened to me and how unfair it was because obviously the other people were so terrible. And, I was, so great after my whatever year of playing. And he was harsh and I'm really glad that he was. And he just said, I don't want to, I honestly, I like you, Annie, and I just don't want to hear it. Like, if you want to go find somebody else to tell these kinds of stories to. I'm not interested in it. But he added, if you have a question about the hand, I will talk to you all day. Like, I want to talk about strategy. So if you have a strategic question, that's fine. If all you want to do is complain about your bad luck, there's nothing to be learned here. So I don't care. I've lost with aces too. Whoa. And, I remember at the time just sort of feeling, but I can assure you that the next time I went in and played, I went in looking at the game differently because I was looking at it for things to go get Eric to like me again. It was like, I'm going to figure out a way to impress this guy. And how am I going to impress him? I'm going to go up to him and I'm going to say, man, I think I really made a mistake on this hand. Because I know now he's told me what would impress him. So now I'm watching the game, like okay, now let me think about where I think I made a mistake. Do I have a really good question to ask him? Where do I think that somebody else is doing something that I really don't understand? Ooh, he'll be really impressed if I do that. And I think that that's really important, is that one of the best ways to reinforce these kinds of behaviors, because they're hard, it's hard to think this way, is to get recruit other people in the process with you, because we want other people to respect us. And I wanted Eric Seidel's respect. So it made me process the game in a really different way. Trust me, that did not come naturally to me. And I feel very lucky that Eric had that incredibly harsh conversation with me.
There's so much in the book from a business standpoint. There's so much good stuff on decision making, but I love the section on expected value and scenario planning when it came to, you gave a story about you consulted with a nonprofit, and it's great because it could be applied to sales teams and business forecasting. So Annie, give us just a lot of great advice here, but give us kind of maybe a macro or some kind of heuristic for better decision making in this sense in our everyday lives. So I was thinking, how do we get to objectivity? Because I think that's the point of this, is what's real. And I was thinking about how I would make decisions in the past where I do the Ben Franklin, right? You do a pro con, and to get to some level of objectivity, what are the factors, and then comparing them to each other. Do you take that process and just add probabilities to them, or some kind of bets to them?
Yeah. So pros and cons are what I would consider kind of a first step to this kind of thinking. Which is sort of what are the good things about the decision? What are the bad things about the decision? What I would like to do is have people do something a little bit that's the next step, which is try to figure out, imagine that you're trying to make a decision. And so let's start here with what does a forecast look like? So you're sort of looking forward. I'm trying to decide between A or B. And think about decision A and what do I think the possible futures are that could result from this? Now, notice that includes some pros and cons, right? Because you're imagining good and bad things about the future there. But what do I think the most likely, what are the scenarios that I think might occur here? And then just take a stab at how likely you think each of those things is.
So for each of the options. So option one, if I choose this, yeah, what's the likely future? Option two, what's the likely future? So you're
well, yeah, and for each one, think of more than one, right? So if I choose option A, what are the possible ways I think things could turn out? If I choose option B, what are the possible ways that things that could turn out, right? So just imagine what those are in the simplest sense, and then try to take some stab at the probability that those things will happen. So if you're thinking about, for example, taking a job, and you want to choose between taking the job or not taking the job, think about, well, how do I think it might turn out? Well, I'm happy in the job. I'm okay in the job, but I'm actually deciding I still want to look. I want to change careers after this job. I get promoted and everything's great. Whatever it might be, just think about what those possible futures might be. In a simple sense, in sales, I get the sale, I don't get the sale, right? So I close it, I don't. And obviously you can get more sophisticated and say, well, I close it for a large amount, I close it for a medium amount, I close it for a small amount, I don't close it at all. And you could be considering two sales strategies, strategy A or strategy B. And you think about those scenarios and then you assign, you try to figure out what probability you think those scenarios will occur with. And don't be scared of assigning the probability, because it doesn't need to be exact. Because what I try to tell people is, trust me, the probability exists. And if you're not trying to get the answer, you're just kind of ignoring it. You're acting as if it will or it won't. But that's not actually true. And you're going to be more of an expert at estimating the probability of your own future than anybody else. And so, and then once you start doing this exercise, it motivates you to start thinking as things turn out as they do, to start coming back and figuring out, well, how could I figure out how to refine that probability better? So in the case, for example, if you're trying to assign the probability of closing a sale, you're much more likely to go back to the lead and ask them questions, regardless of whether you close the sale or not, about what you could have done better, what were the key factors in their decision. It makes you be very information hungry because you're trying to update those probabilities. So that would be the first step, is just what are the likely scenarios? Okay, let me try to assign a probability to that. Now, if you want to get really into it, you can do two things which go side by side, which is a backcast and a forecast. In a backcast, you imagine the end goal, which is positive in this case. You say, I've lost 20 pounds at the end of the year. And you say, all right, what happened that caused me to get here? So it's things like, well, I didn't eat the cookies in the break room, right? I went to the gym every day. So now you can look at, okay, here's everything that happened to get me to this goal. And you can start to put plans in place and commitments in place to how to make sure that those things are happening. It will also help you spot places where you need to get really lucky, which is really important. And you can kind of memorialize all that stuff. What are the things that I can do to strengthen the probabilities? What are the places where I need to get lucky? So I sort of anticipate those. And then you can also, as a companion, because I think it's really important to do, say, okay, now I'm going to do the opposite. I didn't lose any weight during this year. I didn't reach my goal. Why do I think that happened? And what that does is that pulls out all the stress points, where you can see all the possible points of failure. And you can then start to put plans in place for, first of all, to reduce the probability of those failure points, but then also to have plans in place in case those things occur, so that you're not so reactive. It causes you to be much more agile and much more nimble. Now, the great thing that all of this does, which is different than a pro-con list, is now that you've sort of mapped out, well, here are these possible futures, and I've taken a stab at the probabilities, and I'm going to put this down on paper and I'm going to keep it. Because now when things don't work out so well, you're much more likely to remember, oh, well, okay, this not working out future was on my list. Here's a very simple example of why I think that's a really useful exercise. So if we look at if you looked at Nate Silver's site in the week before the Clinton-Trump election, he had the probability of Trump winning, I would say it averaged out to about 35%. So it was 65-35 Clinton-Trump. Now, the pundits, of course, are trying to, sort of express certainty when they're on TV. So they're not saying to people it's 65-35. They're saying Clinton's going to win. Now, notice what that does. When Trump wins, when you don't really think about the probabilities and you're not getting people comfortable with the fact that these two futures are probabilistic in nature, is that people all of a sudden react afterwards like, that was wrong and the polls were wrong and this, how could you not have known? And it's all this recrimination.
But it was 30%. Yeah.
Yeah. If you actually just marked down on a piece of paper 65-35 and you kept it, and now Trump wins the election and you go back and you look at your paper and you say, oh, well, there's the 35% right there. I suppose that wasn't such a surprising result because it was on my sheet, right? So, and then what happens is that you're not being overreactive to the result. You're not saying, how could anybody have seen that coming? That was crazy. Because I'll tell you who did see it coming. Nate Silver saw it coming, right? I mean, he knew that there was this great process. I mean, 35% is a lot. Let's put it this way. Let's say it was even 30%. Here's the question that I would ask you, all of the people who are so surprised and can't even believe that that was the outcome of the election. If I handed you a gun and it had 10 chambers and you knew that 3 of them had bullets in them, how much would I have to pay you to put the gun to your head? So is that really such a surprising result?
Yeah, I remember when that happened. I said, look, you would take an umbrella. If you looked at the weather and it said 35 chance of rain, you would take an umbrella with you. Okay. So why are you so surprised that Trump, won? Okay, he won, but there was a chance. So why? Yeah.
So, and I think that it comes down to this exercise that I'm trying to get people to embrace, which is if you think about the possible futures and you take a stab at the probability and you actually write them down and hold them in mind, now you're taking an umbrella with you, right? Whereas if you act like the pundit and you say, we're not, probabilities, we're just going to tell you which thing, who's going to win, which is what the pundits want to do. They don't want to be seen as waffling. They don't want to be seen as uncertain. Otherwise, we sort of don't think of them as good pundits. We look to the pundits to tell us with certainty. So they're just looking at it and they're like, oh, well, Clinton's going to win. And so what happened? You lost the probabilities now. They've been erased from the board. And then all of a sudden, people are incredibly shocked. And I think we just do a lot better. And honestly, I think we're just emotionally more stable when we recognize that bad things can happen, good things can happen. It's all kind of probabilistic.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big takeaways I got from reading. It's like, if more people, if I could think more often like this, and it all depends on the situation. Sometimes I really do, and then sometimes where I'm emotionally invested, it's harder to do that. But I thought the same thing. I thought this will take away the sting of the decisions not turning your way if you realize the probabilities. Look, and what's in your control, what's not in your control, what part luck plays. In doing the research, I found where you wrote, and I forgive me, I can't remember if this was in the book or not, but somewhere you wrote, feel good about hearing from those who disagree with you. Try not to change your mind. Try to change your mind about one thing every day, which I thought was great, right?
I think that was in Tribe of Mentors.
Okay, there you go. So is there anything of significance that you've changed your mind about over the last few years?
I've changed my mind about so many things. I don't even know where I would start. I mean, I just gave you an example that when I started teaching poker, I changed my mind about my whole game. I've changed my mind. There's so many things I've changed my mind about in terms of parenting. Oh my gosh. I feel like I am a much better parent to my 15-year-old than I was to my first. I had a lot of experience and I kept changing, I changed my mind about a lot of things about how are you supposed to interact and I'm still changing my mind. Like I'm still trying to get it right. I've changed my mind about what I think the right nutritional profile is for me. I've changed my mind about what my exercise regimen is. I've changed my mind about a lot of stuff having to do with politics, where I've really moderated my opinions in a lot of ways on a lot of different issues. One of the things that I really try to force myself to do is my Twitter feed. I try to keep it very balanced between liberal and conservative, with a sprinkle of libertarian in there as well, because I'm really trying to understand. And obviously, I'm trying to pick the more reasonable people on each side of the aisle. But I want to understand what are the really reasonable people saying over here? What are the really reasonable people saying over here? Because I feel like if they're reasonable, they're both reasonable, they're both well-informed, they're both clearly intelligent and articulate, and they're on completely opposite sides of an issue, I need to be listening to both of them. And I would say that is something that I changed, that I've really tried to be open-minded about and change my mind about. And I can tell you that, even 10 or 15 years ago, that would have not been my profile. I was much more sure that I was right about my worldview and what I believed about all sorts of different political issues. And I've just come to the conclusion that, just because somebody disagrees with you doesn't mean that they have evil intent or that they're trying to do bad for the world. Sometimes it does, certainly. But I think that most of the time when you're reading the reasonable people on both sides of the aisle, they're both trying to figure out what's best for everybody. They just disagree about how to get there, and you want to really listen to both of them.
I totally agree with you. I think the motivations are for the most part, good, right? They're trying to, but
for the most part,
yeah. The methods may be way off, but I try to be open to, well, does that work? What does the data say? Or is there, my dad is very conservative. I'm for the most part, I grew up kind of conservative, but I'm liberal. I feel like I'm in the liberal camp now, but I hear I've got friends on both sides, of the issues and politics, which I'm grateful for, because I feel like I'm a little more informed, or at least I can kind of see both sides of an argument. You have a nonprofit, is that right? How I Decide?
Yeah, it's called How I Decide, and we do two things. One is we deliver programs to try to help kids learn good decision skills and critical thinking skills around habit formation, probabilistic thinking, and also decision fitness, which would be in the sort of emotional control, mindfulness world. We programs particularly to underserved kids. And then also as an organization are trying to catalyze conversation and awareness around the need for this to be really part of education. So really trying to, live, walk the walk, as they say, and talk the talk around how important I think that these kinds of decision skills are to creating better outcomes in people's lives. So that's that nonprofit. Yeah, and I'm really excited about it. We founded it in me and my co-founder founded it, and we started operations in 2014. I want to say ish, and so far so good. So excited about that project.
And where can they learn about that project?
They can go to howidecide.org. That's the website, and you can see our programs there, and hopefully enjoy
okay.
what you see there.
And how do people find you?
People can find me at AnnieDuke.com. AnnieDuke.com is my website, and there's a few things you can do there. One is you can hire me. You can also contact me there if you want to just say hi. You can. I do a lot of keynoting and corporate retreats and consulting, so that's why I would say hire me. You can see the speeches. Summaries of the speeches I give, lots of video there. You can also sign up for my newsletter. I send out a newsletter every Friday, which really is looking at things that are currently happening in the world through this lens of, sort of how do we think about this from a decision standpoint? How do we get better at tolerating dissent? How does bias invade the way that we think about things? But really talking about current events as the frame for thinking about those issues. So that's every Friday. You can get that in your inbox, and you can go look at archives on AnnieDuke.com so that you can, test it out before you buy, so to speak. And I'm also pretty active on Twitter. So I post quite a bit on Twitter, things that I find interesting. Hopefully you'll find them interesting too. And you can find me at Annie Duke there. Okay.
Cool. And the book, again, is Thinking in Bets, Making Smarter Decisions When You Don't Have All the Facts. Annie, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me. This has been a great conversation.
Well, that is all the time we have today. Please spread the word if you enjoyed the episode. Leave us a review on iTunes and share it with your friends on your favorite social platforms. Big thank you to Sam Williams, my audio guy. Make sure you visit LarryWeeks.com for all my content, and we will talk again soon.